Paris, July 3rd, 1971. A city built on poetry, obsession, rebellion, and ghosts. While most of the world slept through another summer night, one of the most famous voices of a generation was lying motionless in the bathtub of a fourth-floor apartment at 70-19 Rue Beautreillis. No applause followed, no screaming crowds, no spotlight, no stage, only silence, heavy, unusual, irreversible. Jim Morrison was 27 years old. To call him a rock star is to trivialize the mythology he carried. Morrison was never merely a musician, he was a moving riddle dressed in leather, a prophet drunk on symbolism, a poet who sang like a man wrestling with the universe at 3 a.m. His voice, a velvet sermon laced with danger, convinced millions that freedom was worth burning for. His eyes seemed to look through the world instead of at it, as if the ordinary plane of reality bored him, and he was forever negotiating a deal with the shadows behind it. By 1971, he was no longer the electric shaman prowling stages in Los Angeles. He had fled to Paris to disappear from expectations, lawsuits, paparazzi, hollow fame, and himself a self he no longer recognized. He wrote poetry, wandered aimlessly, drank heavily, argued softly, and carried the ghost of every version of Jim Morrison he used to be. Paris was supposed to save him, or at least hide him. Instead, Paris buried him. Officially, he died of heart failure. No autopsy was performed. No major investigation was launched. The police made a report, glanced at the scene, listened to his longtime partner Pamela Courson's explanation, and closed the file. His body was quietly sealed and placed into the earth at Père Lachaise Cemetery. No press swarm, no forensic curiosity, no serious questioning. It was strangely clean, convenient, quiet. Too quiet. A man whose life was built on disruption left without disturbing anything at all. This alone would have planted doubt, but what followed made disbelief inevitable. Within days, contradictions appeared small at first, like hairline cracks in glass. Then larger, sharp, chaotic. Friends arrived in Paris to find sealed apartment doors and rehearsed answers. People who spoke to Morrison days earlier remembered a man exhausted, reckless, physically fading but not dying. No one could describe the moments before he walked into that bathroom and never walked back out. The police never photographed the apartment. No medical professional confirmed a cause of death firsthand. There were no official toxicology results. The death certificate was signed by a doctor who allegedly never examined the body. And then came the stories, dozens of them splintering outward like smoke. That he died not in a bathtub, but on the filthy floor of a Paris nightclub bathroom, notorious for elite drug trades and discreet overdoses. That Pamela Courson panicked, wrapped him in towels, and summoned help that arrived far too late, then later reshaped the story to protect herself from investigation. That French authorities, unnerved by potential scandal, quietly helped sanitize a narrative to avoid another media circus involving an American icon. That his death was predictable to those who saw the physical collapse beneath the myth, but deliberately concealed from the world. That Jim Morrison, ever the student of theatrical exits and poetic disappearances, orchestrated the vanishing of Jim Morrison, the legend intent on watching the world mourn a ghost while he walked free in obscurity. No single version ruled the public mind. The mystery became larger than the man. When an icon dies without answers, the vacuum becomes its own mythology. Fans compared him to Icarus, flying too close, burning too bright. Others invoked Arthur Rimbaud, another poet who vanished young, legendarily unfinished. Some saw a pagan sacrifice to art, others a tragedy misfiled as romance. Government interference was alleged in certain corners. Cover-ups whispered in others. A growing number insisted he was alive somewhere untraceable, sipping wine under another name, watching the legend bloom behind him with ironic amusement. The truth became a mirror reflecting whatever each believer carried into it. But behind myth, beneath rumor, beneath the barroom folklore and poetic exaggeration, there is always one unavoidable core question. What actually happened to Jim Morrison in the moments between breathing and stillness? Not the legend, not the symbol, the human being, flesh, blood, lungs, fear, exhaustion. The son of an admiral who grew up between military discipline and private rebellion. The reader of Rimbaud, Blake, Nietzsche, and Dionysus. The man who wanted transcendence but found dependency. The artist who demanded chaos but feared losing control. The poet who said death would make him bigger than life, then never clarified whether he feared that fate or desired it. The world treated his passing like the last verse of a Doors song, surreal, tragic, symbolic, and strangely foretold. But deaths foretold are still deaths. Songs end, but bodies remain. Somewhere between the mythology and the medical silence lies a quieter, colder truth. And perhaps the real mystery is not why Morrison died at 27, but why his death was handled like something the world was not supposed to examine too closely. Over half a century later, the case remains unsettling, not because we lack theories, but because we were never given facts solid enough to kill them. There was no courtroom, no inquiry, no forensic battle, no televised inquiry, no documented urgency, only a young woman's voice, a doctor's signature, and an empty bathtub. For a cultural figure who lived loudly, loved loudly, disrupted and loudly demanded to be witnessed, his ending was handled with a silence almost reverent, almost strategic. The world moved on. The graves stayed full. But the questions never learned how to sleep. What happened in that apartment? Who saw what, and who changed the story afterward? Was it a tragic overdose obscured by shame? A misread medical emergency? A preventable death, mistaken for fate? A quiet cover-up to avoid scandal? Or the most successful disappearing act ever staged by a man who adored theatrical exits? Jim Morrison didn't simply die, he evaporated into theories. And when a life ends without closure, mythology becomes the autopsy. The stage went dark. The crowd went silent. But the mystery never left the room. What really happened to Jim Morrison? Not the legend, not the myth, not the poster, the person. The truth hides where the story fractures, and this is where ours begins. To understand how Jim Morrison died, you must first understand how he lived, not the icon, not the rock messiah, but the complicated, contradictory human being who carried the myth long before the myth carried him. James Douglas Morrison was born in 1943 in Melbourne, Florida, into a world defined by order, rigid, disciplined, patriotic order. His father, George Stephen Morrison, was a career naval officer whose life was dictated by rank, duty, and obedience. His future would lead him to command naval forces in the Gulf of Tonkin, becoming a central and controversial figure in the early stages of the Vietnam War. At home, however, the legacy he left was less about military history and more about silence, distance, and emotional restraint. Jim learned early that authority was immovable and emotion was punishable. The Morrison household was one where feelings were not discussed, rebellion was not tolerated, and curiosity was met with suspicion. Young Jim absorbed the tension like oxygen. If the world around him demanded structure, he would instinctively embrace chaos, not merely as rebellion, but as identity. His turning point, the moment he later described as the first crack in his perception of reality, came during a desert road trip through New Mexico when he was just a child. On the highway, his family passed a catastrophic accident involving Native Americans' bodies scattered injured, motionless, wounded, crying from the roadside. While the adults tried to drive past the horror, Jim stared. The scene seared itself permanently into his mind. Later, he would tell friends and interviewers that something shifted inside him that day, that one or more of the dead spirits jumped into his soul. Many dismissed the recollection as symbolic exaggeration, but symbolism was Jim's native language. He didn't report the moment he translated it. From then on, mortality was not a concept to him, but a visitation. As a young man, Morrison was brilliant, restless, unreadable. He devoured literature like Oxygen, Rimbaud, Kerouac, Nietzsche, Blake, Aldous Huxley, Anais Nin. He wasn't just reading poetry, he was ingesting blueprints for liberation madness and ego annihilation. While others memorized lyrics, Jim memorized philosophies. While others sought identity, he sought transcendence. While others feared instability, he treated it as sacred territory. He rarely spoke about wanting fame. What he wanted was experience boundary collapse sensation at maximum voltage. Fame for him was not a goal, it was a tool one he didn't fully understand until it trapped him. Los Angeles in the mid-1960s was starved for a voice that felt dangerous, literary, sexual, apocalyptic. Morrison became that voice almost by accident. He formed the Doors with keyboardist Ray Manzarek, a fellow film student who recognized instantly that Jim was not another aspiring singer, he was a force. From the first rehearsals, the band was different. Their music wasn't built for amusement, it felt ritualistic, hypnotic, ominous. And then Morrison began performing. And performance is the correct word, not singing. Singing was only the surface. He prowled the stage like a man half inside his body and half outside it, channeling something older than rock, older than rebellion. His voice was velvet wrapped around danger, intimate, commanding, serpentine. He didn't invite the audience, he confronted them. When he sang Break On Through to the Other Side, it sounded less like a lyric and more like an invocation. Almost overnight, the Doors became a phenomenon. Light My Fire, Riders on the Storm. The end songs that felt like open portals drenched in eroticism, existential dread, mysticism. Fans didn't just listen, they communed. Critics didn't just write about him, they mythologized him. Journalists struggled to describe him without invoking intoxication, prophecy, sex, death, psychedelia, or ruin. And Jim fed the image. Not because he wanted to be admired, but because he wanted the experience of becoming a symbol. He wanted to test how far identity could be pushed before it dissolved. The pressure of being deified, however, has consequences. By 1969, Morrison was no longer rising, he was unraveling. The Dionysian chaos he once controlled had begun controlling him. Alcohol was no longer an aesthetic companion, but a gravitational force. Performances became unpredictable, mesmerizing one night, incoherent the next. Arrests began accumulating like footnotes. The infamous Miami concert in 1969, where Morrison was accused of exposing himself and inciting lewd behavior, led to charges that threatened to imprison him for years. The media turned on him. The counterculture that crowned him now criticized him. The establishment that once feared him now wanted to prosecute him. He was exhausted from being a symbol. Behind public rebellion was private depletion. Friends recalled a man drinking not to expand consciousness anymore, but to mute it. The wildness was no longer ceremonial, it was survival. The poet was still alive inside him, but buried under the weight of the rock star he never agreed to become. Paris offered an exit. To Jim, Paris was not a vacation, it was erasure. He wanted anonymity, literature, cafes, foggy streets, solitude. He wanted to write again without expectation. He wanted to dissolve Jim Morrison, the rock god, and recover James Douglas Morrison, the human animal. With Pamela Courson, his longtime companion and most complicated love, he left the United States in March 1971. Their relationship was volatile, cyclical, symbiotic. They wounded each other constantly, but lived in a closed universe where departure was more terrifying than pain. She was the only person who had survived every version of him. Paris initially delivered its promise. He walked the city aimlessly for hours. He read. He wrote in notebooks. He gained weight, grew a beard, no longer looked like the leather-clad sex symbol on posters. Strangers passed him without second glances. No interviews, no stage lights, no police harassment. For the first time in years, he was invisible. Invisibility is a kind of rebirth. Friends who visited saw two different Jims depending on the hour. There was the soft, reflective poet who spoke gently about art, history, and literature over coffee. And then there was the man dissolving into drink, coughing violently at night, gasping through episodes that hinted at a body fraying from the inside. Some saw deterioration, others saw liberation. Few realized they were witnessing an ending. Paris did not heal him. It simply muted the noise around his collapse. His lifestyle had consequences that no mythology could soften. Chronic alcohol abuse, probable respiratory complications, rumored drug exposure. His body was no longer an instrument. It was an alarm system running out of voltage. The tragedy is not that he lived recklessly. Many geniuses do. The tragedy is that when his life tilted from self-destruction into medical emergency, almost no one recognized the threshold had been crossed. There were no rehabilitation efforts, no intervention teams, no industry managers forcing treatment or surveillance. Morrison, unlike the performers who came after him, lived in a period where the idea of checking on the rock star before he dies simply did not exist as public duty. He was allowed to disappear privately, and he was allowed to decline privately. And so, by the summer of 1971, in the narrow streets of Le Marais, in a quiet apartment away from the stage, the question was no longer philosophical. It was physiological. Not how far will he go, but how much longer can a body endure a life lived at maximum intensity? No myth predicted what happened next. No prophecy prepared anyone for a death that arrived not like thunder or poetry or rebellion, but like silence water and unanswered questions. Paris did not mourn Jim Morrison at first because Paris never knew it was losing him. There were no headlines in the final days, no concerned public statements, no dawning sense of emergency. He was simply a man drifting through summer streets with a notebook and heavy-eyed fatigue, another expatriate poet in a city already crowded with ghosts of artists who had burned too bright. But those who were close enough to observe noticed the cracks widening. In late June 1971, Morrison was visibly ill, not romantically disheveled in the rock and roll sense, but physically struggling. His longtime friend and Doors collaborator Ray Manzarek later recalled that Jim sounded different on the phone. Labored breaths, long silences between sentences, a voice lower, not from mystique, but strain. Others who saw him in Paris remember coughing fits that bent him, double moments where sweat appeared, though the air was mild and a skin pallor that seemed less literary and more alarming. There were moments of clarity, too sharp, poetic, thoughtful. He spoke about wanting to publish a new book of poetry, recording spoken word, retreating somewhere rural. He laughed in sudden bursts. He quoted Baudelaire. But the energy beneath these flashes was replicative, not restorative. It was the mind sprinting while the body lagged behind like a fading shadow. His companion, Pamela Courson, was one of the few constants in those unstable years, but stability was never their design. Their relationship was symmetrical, chaos, love dependency, jealousy, devotion, destruction, repair, repeat. They lived as though intensity was the only valid emotional meter. Tenderness and catastrophe occupied the same room without contradiction. To understand what happened next, one must understand this. Jim and Pamela were less two separate people than a closed ecosystem of two, cut off from outside interference, intervention, or moderation. That isolation, once romantic, was about to become medically catastrophic. July 2nd, 1971, the night before. On the evening of July the 2nd, witnesses later reported seeing Morrison and Courson outside. Accounts vary in texture, but align in implication. Morrison looked tired, slowed, physically uncomfortable. There was no visible exhilaration, no wild, intoxicated theatrics, no poetic bravado on display. The legend for once was quiet. That night, they went to the Rock and Roll Circus nightclub, a place already notorious in Paris for late-night excess discreet drug exchanges, underground glamour, and wealthy patrons looking to orbit chaos without consequence. This was not a dignified music hall. It was a basement world where transactions happened in shadows and bathrooms doubled as private markets. What happens next is where the story fractures. No official report contains these hours. No investigation preserved them. But over the decades, a hauntingly consistent, unofficial narrative has emerged stitched together from overlapping testimonies of club employees, expatriates, drug community whispers, and those who later admitted involvement when time made prosecution irrelevant. According to multiple later accounts, none officially validated, but eerily aligned, Morrison was offered heroin at the club. Not a dramatic injection scene, not a moral downfall moment, but an offer presented casually, socially, almost mundanely. Morrison was not known as a habitual heroin user. Alcohol was his downfall, not opiates. But curiosity, fatigue, access, and numbness can create a fatal equation even without addiction history. The story told by former club associates is unnervingly specific. Morrison, unfamiliar with dosage, may have mistaken high-grade heroin for cocaine. The difference between experimentation and medical catastrophe can be measured in milligrams. Inside the club bathroom, he allegedly inhaled or ingested the substance. Minutes later, his body reacted fast and violently collapsed respiratory distress, the terrifying seizure of a system shutting down without warning. Panic followed. A man with too much heat around his name collapsing in a bathroom of an unofficial drug bazaar was not a situation anyone present wanted to inherit. Emergency services were not called from the scene? Not immediately, not at all according to multiple later recollections. Instead, a decision was made informal, collective instinctive, and disastrous. If authorities were involved, the club would be scrutinized, shut down, and buried under scandal. More importantly, anyone connected to the moment could face legal fallout. So the response was not rescue, it was containment. Morrison was reportedly carried out quietly draped to suggest intoxication rather than emergency and transported back to his apartment at Rue Beautreillis. Some versions claim he was still alive but fading in and out of consciousness. Others claim breathing was already perilously shallow, but the consistent detail is impossible to ignore. He was moved, not saved. The apartment. Inside the dim Paris flat, the atmosphere was not rock star chaos. It was domestic stillness. Books, ashtrays, worn rugs, shadows, a bathtub. No syringes on floors, no dramatic destruction, no overturned furniture. This is one reason the official narrative of a calm, natural death later felt so plausible on first glance. The scene looked non-violent because it had been curated to look ordinary. According to Pamela's statement, the only primary account ever formally recorded, Jim returned home feeling unwell. He decided to take a bath. She fell asleep. Later, she found him submerged, lifeless. But time fractures this version. Friends and later testimonies raised logistical contradictions. The timeline between the nightclub closing hours and her discovery does not align cleanly with normal sleep intervals. Her emotional state in later weeks suggested not sudden shock, but processed devastation. There were inconsistencies in how long she claimed to have waited before seeking help. No wet footsteps, discarded towels, or transitional mess fit the story of a man who physically walked himself into a bathtub before dying. Most hauntingly, Morrison had a known fear of drowning. The idea that his final act while physically distressed would be to submerge himself willingly into water contradicted his psychological history. A far more medically plausible sequence supported by accidental overdose cases is this. Morrison was already losing consciousness when entering the bathroom. The bathtub may not have been the place of death. It may have been the place of deposition, the only location in the apartment where a body could be discreetly placed without alarming neighbors, passers-by, or emergency responders before a decision was made. Water in such cases serves an unintended symbolic function. It erases evidence, softens forensic distinctions, obscures time of death, and rewrites cause from overdose to cardiac or pulmonary failure. The morning of July 3, 1971. When help was finally summoned, it was no longer urgent. A doctor arrived at the apartment allegedly contacted by acquaintances rather than through official emergency lines. His examination was brief. There was no autopsy ordered, highly irregular for an American citizen dying at 27 under unclear medical circumstances. No toxicology report was produced. No forensic photographs were taken. Police wrote a report, but it was procedural, minimal, incurious. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure. No further medical rationale. No investigative escalation. No biological evidence preserved for review. No second opinions. No chancery of inquiry. No interrogation of the situation. The world would now inherit a conclusion without a process. The announcement. News of Morrison's death did not explode. It spread unevenly like smoke from a smothered flame instead of a detonation. When American media confirmed it, the public response was confusion, first, grief, second, disbelief, third. Fans were unsettled less by the death itself than by its texture. It lacked narrative shape. Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, both lost in the preceding year, died with visible tragedy, documented chaos, public unraveling. Their endings, while devastating, fit the tragic arc the world had already braced for. Morrison's did not. His death felt edited. No dramatic collapse on a hotel floor, no final interview, no last public meltdown, no hospital scene, no medical breakdown witnessed, no forensic clarity, no accountability, no final witness beyond one person whose testimony was never tested by scrutiny. Only a bathtub, only silence, only a closed report. Even early headlines reflected disruption rather than certainty. Did Jim Morrison really die in a bathtub rock? Poet's death, shrouded in questions. No autopsy for Morrison sparks mystery. Within days, flowers overtook the gates of Père Lachaise. Strangers cried. Pilgrims appeared. The world processed grief faster than it processed truth. The legend cemented itself immediately, not because answers existed, but because answers were absent. Jim Morrison had not just died without clarity, he had died without narrative ownership. And into that vacuum speculation rushed like floodwater. Not just rumors, not gossip, but alternative histories constructed not from imagination alone, but from logical disbelief, institutional silence, medical implausibility, and the one stubborn fact no obituary could fade. A 27-year-old man in physical decline, last seen alive in a nightclub, heavy with narcotics, transported instead of treated, examined without investigation, and buried without forensic inquiry, did not leave behind an explanation. He left behind a riddle disguised as a death certificate. The first rule of any suspicious death investigation is preservation. Preserve the body, the environment, the medical evidence, the witness accounts, and the timeline. In the case of Jim Morrison, almost none of these pillars were upheld. Not through deliberate erasure, at least not initially, but through indifference, assumption, and timing. France in 1971 did not treat the death of an American rock star as a matter of criminal urgency. He did not die on stage in public or under dramatic conditions that demanded inquiry. He died in a bathtub privately abroad under the care of his partner, with a doctor signing off heart failure. At the surface, there was nothing that formally screamed crime scene, but the surface is the very thing investigations are meant to break. No autopsy, no toxicology, no forensics. The most enduring pillar of doubt is this: no autopsy was performed. For a 27-year-old man, foreign national, sudden unexplained death history of substance abuse, found unresponsive in water, last seen in a nightclub environment, an autopsy is not merely reasonable. It is automatic in almost every modern jurisdiction. In 1971, Paris, it should have been strongly advised at minimum. Instead, no internal examination occurred. No toxicology screening was conducted. No tissue, blood, or organ samples were preserved for analysis. No forensic timeline of death was estimated. No drowning assessment was made. No heart pathology was examined to verify heart failure. No medical cross-examination followed. The absence of an autopsy did more than close questions, it prevented questions from ever being formed. The official explanation, heart failure, was medically broad to the point of meaninglessness. Heart failure is not a cause, it is a final result. Every human death ends in heart failure. Without identifying why the heart failed, the phrase explains nothing. Accidental overdose possible, respiratory collapse possible, pulmonary complications from pneumonia or tuberculosis both rumored possible, acute heroin toxicity possible, alcohol poisoning possible, water aspiration post-collapse rather than drowning entirely possible. The investigation never eliminated a single possibility because it never investigated a single one. A doctor who saw but did not examine. The physician who signed Morrison's death certificate, Dr. Max Vassil, has been the subject of debate for decades. His involvement raises two unavoidable questions. Did he examine the body personally or sign based on circumstance and assumption? Why was he called instead of emergency responders, the police medical unit, or a hospital coroner? Accounts surrounding his presence diverge, but none describe a thorough clinical process. There was no pulse monitoring, no neurological check, no resuscitation record, no documented attempt at emergency intervention, no cardiac analysis, no observable determination of drowning. No medical justification for certifying natural causes beyond a cursory, visual evaluation. This is not a medical examination. This is a confirmation of stillness. In major sudden deaths, doctors diagnose through evidence. In this case, evidence was replaced with narrative. The only account came from a single witness. Pamela Corson was the only person present when Jim Morrison was found. She was also the person who would bear the greatest legal risk if illegal substances or negligence were involved. This does not imply guilt, it explains human behavior under threat. Her statement was simple, sorrowful, and linear. Jim was unwell, took a bath, she slept, later found him unresponsive, summoned help. But her version was not recorded on audio, not transcribed under formal interrogation, not challenged with forensic contradictions, not corroborated with medical or scene evidence, not compared against toxicological data, never tested in a legal setting. A statement without scrutiny becomes narrative, not testimony. Friends who later questioned her privately described emotions that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, less shock, more containment. They also recalled her refusing to revisit details, deflecting timelines, and reacting with defensiveness rather than clarity when pressed on sequence. Grief does not follow rules, but investigations require them. Because there was no investigation, grief filled the procedural vacuum. The scene was not secured. No photographs were taken of the bathroom, the body, the water, the surrounding surfaces, or the apartment condition. No timeline reconstruction was attempted. No forensic assessment analyzed. Water displacement to determine whether a body entered while alive or was placed after death. Lung fluid analysis to distinguish drowning from post-mortem immersion. Bath temperature to estimate time of death. Skin wrinkling patterns that indicate duration of water submersion. Toxic residue from vomiting foam or respiratory collapse common in overdose, drowning. Bottle residues, powders, capsules, or paraphernalia. The most common forensic markers that differentiate accidental death from body placed after death were never evaluated. Without documentation, the bathtub became less a piece of evidence and more a symbolic stage. The nightclub discrepancy that was never officially asked. Perhaps the most haunting absence in official documentation is this. The Rock and Roll Circus nightclub was never mentioned in any police report. Not questioned, not visited, not investigated, not attached to timeline building, not treated as a relevant location. Yet every unofficial reconstruction of that night and fear expressed by those who worked at the club later in life centers on that building. Former staff and Paris nightlife figures interviewed decades later, long past legal exposure, offered overlapping claims. Morrison was alive when he arrived but impaired when he left. Drugs circulated that night with unusual potency. Panic spread inside the club when he reacted badly. There was immediate concern, not casual observation. The decision was made not to call emergency services from the venue. He was transported out discreetly to avoid police entry into the club. These statements are not singular outliers, they form a consistent alternative timeline that official files never acknowledged. Why were these leads never pursued at the time? Because the investigation did not fail to pursue them. It never began pursuing anything at all. Institutional disinterest or institutional protection. Two competing interpretations exist. Institutional apathy. France saw another foreign celebrity death, assumed drugs were involved, presumed it accidental, and saw no duty to expend resources. Quiet institutional containment. Paris in the 1970s thrived on elite nightlife tourism. Scandals involving major cultural figures, narcotics rings, and underground clubs posed economic and diplomatic inconvenience. Making Morrison's death a public criminal inquiry would not only expose him, it would expose the infrastructure around him. The first explanation is passive negligence. The second is strategic silence. Neither involves justice seeking truth, the result of a non-investigation. By closing the case early, authorities ensured there would be no suspects, no cause of death beyond generality, no legal implications for anyone involved, no drug trail leading back to distributors or venues, no accountability for the decision not to call emergency services, no challenge to Pamela Courson's narrative, no confrontation between eyewitness memory and forensic science, no case file large enough to dispute. The paradox is this: Jim Morrison did not receive a flawed investigation. He received no investigation at all. And in the absence of investigation, myths do not emerge from imagination alone, they emerge from the logical residue of unanswered procedural questions. When evidence is missing, stories become evidence. When the file is empty, rumors testify. When science is silent, psychology becomes the detective. And when death leaves no forensic shadow, suspicion becomes the only forensic footprint left. If conventional investigation collapses in the crucial first 48 hours, the case does not truly begin, it fossilizes. Evidence decays, witnesses rewrite memories, institutions disengage, grief hardens, and speculation evolves into parallel history. Jim Morrison's death followed this trajectory with unusual speed. Within weeks, the official file was sealed not by classification, but by irrelevance. The Parisian authorities did not announce secrecy, they simply stopped asking questions. The world filled that silence with its own interrogations. A funeral without scrutiny. Morrison was buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery on July 7, 1971, a mere 4 days after his death. There was no long process of examination, no diplomatic delay for formal inquiry, no request from American authorities for investigation, no legal hesitation about cause of death. Paperwork flowed faster than facts. His burial was intimate, almost abrupt, attended by only a handful of people. To mourners, it felt poetic. To investigators, it would have felt jurisdictionally suffocating. Once a body is interred, especially without autopsy documentation or chain of custody protocols, the possibility of forensic truth collapses into near impossibility. In Morrison's case, by the time skepticism emerged publicly, the physical evidence that could confirm or deny any theory was already underground. In true crime chronology, this is the moment the case transitions from investigatable tragedy to historical mystery. And mysteries behave differently. They breed. The diverging timelines. By the late 1970s, two competing narratives had crystallized, one official, one subterranean. Timeline A, the official version. Morrison returned home feeling ill. Took a bath. Pamela found him later. He died of heart failure. No criminal or medical suspicion. Timeline B, the unofficial reconstruction. Morrison was exposed to dangerous drugs at the rock and roll circus. Collapsed inside the nightclub bathroom. Emergency services were not called to avoid scandal. He was moved while incapacitated or dying. Death occurred before, during, or shortly after transport. The bathtub later became scenery, not location. Medical review was circumstantial, not investigative. Timeline A was preserved by paperwork. Timeline B was preserved by people. And unlike official statements, human recollections continued evolving not randomly, but convergently. Separate voices interviewed decades apart from different social circles repeated the same structural story with slight variations in detail but identical core mechanics. This is not how myths behave. Myths exaggerate outward. This is how witness echo behaves. Stories collapse inward toward the same nucleus. The club employees who spoke only after the statute expired. In the 1980s and 1990s, long after legal consequences could reach them, individuals who had worked in or around the rock and roll circus began speaking in fragments, in interviews, small publications, musician memoirs, nightlife retrospectives, and cultural documentaries. Their statements followed a pattern. Morrison was at the club hours before his death. He was seen ingesting drugs not typical of his known habits. His reaction was severe and immediate, not gradual. Staff recognized medical danger and not drunken theatrics. There was panic among club affiliates, not curiosity. The environment discouraged police presence at all costs. He left the venue horizontally or semi-conscious, not self-guided. One former club figure later summarized the unwritten rule of that world: you protect the place first, the person second, always. No single testimony proved the theory, but together they indict the process that never occurred. Pamela Corson witness or gatekeeper. When a death has no witnesses, mystery emerges. When a death has one witness, psychology emerges. Pamela was not a villain, nor a detective, nor a reliable archivist. She was a 20-something woman with her own demons, grief substance, dependency, fear of legal prosecution, and emotional entanglement. In her tragedy, she may not have understood how to narrate, defend, or emotionally survive. Her accounts, when she offered them at all, were sparse, fragile, and static. The more the public questioned, the more she withdrew. She did not campaign for clarity, nor did she rewrite the story with theatrical self-defense. She protected it by refusing to expand it. Some interpreted this as concealment. Others interpreted it as collapse. But one truth remains psychologically consistent. An innocent witness who fears prosecution may behave indistinguishably from a guilty one: silence avoidance, rigidity, emotional shutdown, and resistance to interrogation. Especially if drugs were present, even indirectly. Especially if help was delayed. Especially if fear dictated decisions in the moment. Especially if loving someone accidentally intersected with failing to save them. Pamela did not live long enough to witness history's verdict. She died 3 years later of a heroin overdose at age 27, alone the same age as Jim, sealing their narratives together in cultural memory, tragedy, and unanswered questions. After her death, there were no primary witnesses left within legal reach of inquiry. The case was now officially unsolvable. But unsolvable cases do not die. They metastasize. The conspiracy migration. With no forensic barriers and no legal authority defending a definitive cause, Morrison's death became the largest playground for competing explanations. Accidental overdose covered to avoid criminal scandal. Medical emergency misinterpreted as intoxication. Collapsed lung or chronic respiratory infection masked as heart failure. Deliberate cover-up by French authorities to protect cultural institutions. Intentional disappearance, the ultimate Morrison performance piece. Foul play involving underground narcotics networks. Tampered scene to protect someone from prosecution. Of these, only one category had zero real-world connective tissue: the idea that he faked his own death and lived on in anonymity. While romantically aligned with Morrison's mythology, it lacks behavioral, psychological, or logistical plausibility. Disappearing permanently requires preparation, secrecy, infrastructure, complicity, and strategic patience. Morrison, for all his theatrical instincts, lived chaotically, impulsively, indulgently, not strategically. He was many things. A long-term escape artist was not one of them. The remaining theories, however, do not require reckless imagination, only ordinary human motivations: fear, reputation, liability, profit, panic, avoidance. Most cover-ups are not operatic. They are administrative. The cultural transformation of uncertainty. By the 1990s, scholars, music historians, journalists, and biographers stopped asking, "Did he die suspiciously?" and began asking a more revealing question. Why was his death handled in a way that eliminated the possibility of verification? Because mystery is not the same as conspiracy. Mystery is a symptom. Conspiracy is only one possible diagnosis. As decades passed, the story stabilized into a hybrid form, no longer raw rumor, not exactly resolved fact, but a historical ambiguity accepted as culturally permanent. The world collectively internalized the idea that the bathtub story is functionally incomplete. Heart failure was a placeholder, not an explanation. Drugs were almost certainly involved directly or indirectly. The most critical hours were never officially documented. The people who could confirm the timeline either feared doing so died or waited too long. The truth was neither fantastical nor fully benign. And ambiguity itself became part of Jim Morrison's legacy, because unlike most unsolved deaths, his mystery did not feel intrusive. It felt narratively consistent with the life he lived. If ever a cultural figure was destined to die without an answer simple enough to fit a police file, it was the man who once wrote, "No one here gets out alive." The world assumed he meant death. Perhaps he meant explanation. By the turn of the millennium, the investigation was no longer active, but the inquiry never ceased. It simply migrated from police to historians, psychologists, musicians, cultural theorists, forensic skeptics, and fans. The death of Jim Morrison stopped belonging to criminology and began belonging to epistemology, the study of what we can know, how we know it, and what we convince ourselves we know in the absence of proof. The file was closed. The questions were not. Because cold cases do not always get colder. Some grow warmer with time, not because evidence increases, but because silence itself becomes evidence of something worth asking about. And in Morrison's case, silence was the loudest witness of all. No cold case is ever resurrected neatly. There is no cinematic moment where a drawer opens to reveal a missing document that suddenly solves everything. In mysteries like Jim Morrison's, the breakthrough does not arrive as revelation, it arrives as convergence. Fragments from different decades told by disconnected people finally form a coherent shape, not because they are official, but because they no longer contradict one another. By the early 2000s and 2010s, the conversation around Morrison's death had shifted. It stopped orbiting supernatural theories, staged disappearance fantasies, and romantic conspiracies. Scholars, journalists, and investigators began narrowing the lens towards something less theatrical and more human. A preventable death misfiled as mysticism, protected by silence and fossilized into legend. And while no court would ever reopen a case without physical evidence, a different kind of inquiry, historical autopsy by testimony, began constructing the most plausible timeline yet. The late confessions. Unlike police interrogations, truth in cold cultural cases often emerges from people who waited long enough to lose something stronger than fear relevance. Former nightclub associates, no longer tied to reputations or statutes of limitation, began speaking in longer-form interviews. Music historians recorded conversations previously dismissed as rumor. French nightlife figures admitted privately what they would never have spoken publicly in 1971. Book authors, biographers, and even former Paris narcotics intermediaries added consistent pieces to a puzzle originally scattered across decades. When these accounts are extracted of embellishment and aligned strictly by repetition rather than drama, they converge on a disturbing but believable consensus. Morrison did not die instantly in the apartment. He medically collapsed earlier in the night. His collapse occurred after ingesting a substance far stronger than expected or familiar. The emergency response he needed was not called from the location where it happened. He was relocated while in crisis rather than treated at the scene. By the time medical attention reached him, the situation was beyond reversal. The bathtub became the official location of death because it was the only location that could not incriminate anyone still alive. This is not hypothesis stitched from exaggeration, it is conclusion stitched from overlap. The human element instead of the mythic one. To understand this outcome, one must strip away mythology and look only at psychology incentives and human limitation. The nightclub's priority was self-preservation, not emergency medicine. The people present were witnesses to a scandal, not trained first responders. A phone call to police from a narcotics-heavy venue involving an American icon would have destroyed livelihoods and triggered criminal investigations. Moving a dying man seemed in panic easier than explaining why help was delayed. No one intended to kill him, but multiple people unintentionally ensured he would not be saved. Once he was gone, truth would not have reduced the damage, only spread it. Tragedies concealed by self-preservation rarely involve villainy. More often they involve fear cascading into consequence. Morrison was not the victim of an assassination or a cover-up designed by governments. He was the victim of a collapse that no one in the room was prepared, permitted, or brave enough to handle correctly. The critical failure was not deception, it was delay. Every medical forensic expert consulted retroactively about the scenario agreed on a key principle. In opioid or respiratory collapse, minutes decide survival, not hours. If Morrison ingested a high concentration of heroin thinking it was cocaine, a claim repeated independently by multiple nightclub sources, the physiological chain reaction would have been rapid. Respiratory depression, confusion, loss of coordination, sudden unconsciousness, failure to breathe autonomously, cardiac collapse from oxygen deprivation. Heroin does not need long to kill. It needs only time without intervention. And the one variable that could not be reconstructed or recovered was time. Not the time he died, the time he stopped receiving help. Moving an unconscious body waiting instead of calling, avoiding emergency systems to prevent discovery, these were not murderous decisions, but survival-driven ones. And in that kind of panic, death is not intentional, but it is inevitable. The bathtub was not the crime scene, it was the conclusion of one. When forensic psychologists and crime historians analyze the known facts, one detail becomes central. There was no emotional, psychological, or behavioral reason for Morrison, in a medically distressed state, to draw a bath, enter it, and submerge himself intentionally. There are, however, several practical reasons a bathtub becomes a staging environment after death. It explains water in the lungs without forensic testing. It blends medical tragedy with a quiet domestic setting. It carries no witnesses beyond the partner present. It reduces visible evidence of drugs or struggle. It generates a non-investigative cause like heart failure or natural death. It prevents immediate police suspicion. It protects everyone except the deceased. The bathtub was not where the crisis started. It was where the crisis ended in narrative form. The doctor signed a story, not a diagnosis. Modern medical specialists examining the limited documentation retroactively agree on 3 points. Heart failure on the death certificate was not incorrect. It was simply not informative. No competent physician could identify why a healthy 27-year-old's heart failed without internal examination. The absence of an autopsy indicates not medical confidence, but medical disengagement from causation. The doctor who signed the certificate did not lie. He simply did not investigate. Pamela Corson carried the truth and the blame, and neither ever spoke back. Pamela did not engineer a crime scene. She managed a catastrophe. By the time she was left alone with the aftermath, her choices were no longer between truth and deception. They were between one unbearable consequence and another. Tell the truth and expose everyone in the room, or stay silent and become the sole container of guilt. History chose for her. She was judged as suspicious, not because her story was malicious, but because it was incomplete. Silence read like strategy. Trauma read like evasion. Devotion read like complicity. And grief with addiction on top read like guilt regardless of intent. Her early death ensured that the last living witness never outgrew the worst moment of her life. One tragedy sealed another. The real breakthrough wasn't new evidence. It was the death of the alternative theories. By the 2010s, nearly every serious historian and biographer had reached the same landing zone. Morrison did not fake his death. He was not murdered by a conspiracy. He was not targeted politically. He did not intentionally choose suicide that night. His death was not poetic destiny or mythic design. It was accidental, mishandled, undocumented, and unrecoverable. The world did not receive a dramatic solution. It received a slow elimination of unrealistic ones. The mystery is not what killed him. The mystery is why we were never allowed to watch the process unfold that could have saved him. The aftermath radiated outward in waves. His bandmates dissolved into grief instead of activism. There were no demands for investigation, no marches for inquiry, no petitions for autopsy. There was resignation, not revolt. Perhaps they already sensed the truth without needing it spoken. Fans filled the void with candles, graffiti poems, pilgrimage. Stone monuments were easier to face than unanswered medical questions. Père Lachaise became less a cemetery and more a shrine to the idea of the unclaimed ending. The world did not want a forensic report. It wanted poetry. Journalists coined phrases like, death by myth, the rock star who died twice, once in life, once in explanation, autopsy of an absence. Film music and literature treated his death like a plot element written by the universe rather than a scenario produced by preventable human error. And yet at the margins of myth, outside the murals, outside the leather jackets and vinyl records, a quieter tragedy remained. Jim Morrison did not die because no one tried to save him. He died because the people present were trying to save themselves first. Not from death, from consequence. The truth was not spectacular, but it was sincere. The revelation, when stripped of rumor and romantic distortion, sounds painfully ordinary. A young man whose body was weakened by years of alcohol exhaustion and respiratory stress encountered a drug stronger than his system could absorb. He collapsed in a place where witnesses feared calling for help. The delay cost him rescue. The relocation cost him investigation. The silence after cost him explanation. And the legend he left behind consumed the autopsy he never received. There was no mastermind. There was no grand scheme. There was no coded disappearance. There was only a bad decision made in panic. A lethal window of untreated time. A world more comfortable mythologizing artists than protecting them. His final tragedy was not dying young. It was dying in a moment that truth never reached. Jim Morrison never wanted to live quietly. Even in childhood, he pressed his ear against the edge of the world, searching for what vibrated beneath its surface. He didn't want to be remembered as a rock star. He wanted to be remembered as a force, something uncontainable, unknowable, dangerous. In the end, the images that survived him were exactly that, blurred, conflicted, contradictory, larger than life, yet painfully fragile in hindsight. His death in Paris was never just about how a man's heart stopped. It became a referendum on a generation's exhaustion. By 1971, the 1960s were no longer young. The revolution was older, bruised, strung out, unsure of its direction. The voices that once felt invincible, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and now Morrison, had burned too bright too fast. Jim was the third in a trilogy of lost icons, a holy trinity of self-destruction mythologized almost instantly into tragic legend. And legends don't require answers. Legends resist them. What remains remarkable more than the unanswered questions is how intensely the world still asks them. The average unsolved case cools with time. Names fade. Memories thin. Interest shrinks to footnotes, archives, forgotten file folders. But Morrison's death does the opposite. The farther we move from 1971, the hotter the mystery burns. Not because the evidence grows stronger, but because the symbol grows larger. We're not just trying to solve a death. We're trying to solve a man who made sure no one ever truly could. Every theory, overdose, stage, death, government interference, accidental medical crisis, deliberate disappearance reveals less about the night he died and more about the hunger of the culture that survived him. The conspiracy believers want secret wars. Intelligence shadows escape routes into invisibility. The skeptics want tragic simplicity, recklessness, inevitability. The romantics want exile, rebirth, a poet vanishing on his own terms. Everyone wants Morrison to have authored his own ending, even if the ending destroyed him. But history is rarely this poetic. More often it is messy, anticlimactic, indifferent. The truth, if we strip away the mythology, may be quieter than we wish. A man worn down by fame that felt like a trap. A voice frayed from being mistaken for a prophet instead of a human. A body exhausted long before its time from living in overdrive. A night in Paris that contained no grand design, only fatigue chemicals, and a heart that had finally taken too much. If this version disappoints, it is only because reality doesn't flatter gods. It only buries them. Yet even the most grounded truth cannot survive alone in this story. Too much went unrecorded, untested, unspoken. The alleged witnesses who vanished. The medical omissions left unexplained. The sealed files never opened. The police who treated his death like paperwork, not history. The people who knew something, but knew silence better. The friends with memories blurred by time and guilt. The lovers who protected the myth because the myth protected the man they had known. Even the grave contributes to the mystery, quiet, understated, almost uninviting, tucked away beneath layers of pilgrim graffiti and whispered offerings. Not the resting place of a legend, but of someone who desperately wanted privacy, even while demanding transcendence. The irony is unmistakable. Morrison spent his life cultivating chaos and spectacle, and his death, supposedly the most ordinary moment of all, became his most mythic performance. The deeper tragedy hidden beneath the folklore is simpler. A brilliant, erratic, wounded man never got to become the writer he believed he would grow into. Never got to see who he might have been without the spotlight, without the appetite for annihilation, without the world begging him to self-destruct so it could memorize the wreckage. He died at 27 not because destiny favored symmetry, but because 27 was all he managed to reach while sprinting ahead of consequence. If he had lived, perhaps the world would have eventually become bored of him. Legends rarely survive aging. Maybe anonymity would have been his last victory, his quiet revenge on the excess of his youth. But he never got the chance to disappoint the myth he became. Instead, we carry the unanswered question forward like an inherited relic. Was Jim Morrison a poet trapped in a rock star's body, or a rock star terrified of being ordinary? Or was he both burning from the friction between identities he could never reconcile? As decades pass, new evidence will likely never appear. The people who were present are disappearing into time. Memories fade, recollections contradict certainty, dissolves. What remains is not a case file, but an echo whispers traded like contraband convictions, built on absence conclusions shaped by desire. Perhaps the truth was never sealed by secrecy. Perhaps it was simply scattered small pieces drifting in different directions, never gathered in one hand. And so we end where we began, not with an answer, but a question, not about how he died, but about why he still lives in our imagination with such intensity. Jim Morrison didn't just die in Paris on a July morning in 1971. He left behind a void shaped like a riddle. And riddles, unlike bodies, don't decay. They deepen. They echo. They wait for someone to solve them long after the world has stopped asking anyone else. Whether we interpret his story as tragedy, caution, conspiracy poetry, or unfinished revolution, one thing endures: Jim Morrison is not remembered for the moment his heart stopped. He is remembered for all the moments he refused to make sense. And maybe that, more than any theory, is the truest clue he ever left behind. Because some men don't want to be understood. Some men want to be remembered as the question, not the answer.